You're listening to the October 8th, 2015 edition of the Cybercrime and Business Podcast, the weekly podcast that's focused exclusively on how the world of cybercrime is impacting business. On today's episode, we have an interview with Monica Eaton-Cardone. She's the managing partner for eConsumer Services. The first of this month was the deadline for EMV, and the liability for card-present fraud has now shifted. We discussed that deadline and how it impacts consumers and businesses, as well as some issues surrounding the transition to EMV technology in the U.S. This podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. I am Jeff Peters, Surfwatch Labs editor, and I'm here with Matt Leifus, Surfwatch Labs writer. Matt and I are back after taking off last week for a special episode on social engineering, and we'll be doing those episodes occasionally a few times throughout the year on different topics for best practices for cybersecurity. The interview with Monica Eaton-Cardone will be coming up later. But first, as always, we're going to recap some of the top trending cybercrime events, advisories, and legal actions from the past week.
Before I get into that, Jeff, just a quick little side thing. Have you been to a store recently that has one of those EMV readers?
I don't pay attention enough, really, when I buy stuff. I've been using cash a lot because, not for any security reason, but just because it helps me to budget better. So I guess I haven't really paid attention much. Have you seen them recently?
I have. As you know, Jeff and I, talking outside of the podcast, I'm currently renovating a house and buying a lot of stuff at a hardware store. And I'm at this card and I'm just swiping my credit card through this thing and it's not working. I'm like, oh yeah, chip and pin. I forgot. So actually I have to stick it in there. It reads it. Kind of nice. I was just wondering on the off chance you've seen one. I thought they were pretty neat.
Yeah, I've seen them before. I guess I just haven't noticed which stores around me or have the upgraded technology.
Let's go ahead and get to the top trending industries targets. This week, Surfwatch Labs collected data on 69 industry targets negatively associated with cybercrime, and another 254 being discussed on the dark web. From that data, we come up with the top industry targets for the week. Coming in at number 3, we have Kmart Australia. Australian Kmart customers were informed that some of their personal information may have been compromised in a data breach. Hackers were able to penetrate Kmart's online operations, which exposed the personal data, names, email addresses, delivery and billing addresses, telephone numbers, and product purchase details were all compromised in the breach. It is currently unknown when the breach actually occurred and how many customers were actually affected. Coming at number 2, we have Patreon. The popular crowdfunding site Patreon suffered a data breach. Hackers accessed Patreon's networks and gathered information on 2.3 million Patreon customers. The hackers dumped 13.7 gigabytes of data online that displayed user account information, source code for the website, and donation records. Social security numbers, passwords, and tax information were accessed in the breach, but were not included in the data dumps online. Coming in at number 1, we have Scottrade. Scottrade made several headlines this week after the company announced a data breach. The breach affected about 4.6 million customers. Client names, addresses, email addresses, and social security numbers were all potentially compromised in the breach. Scottrade had to be informed their networks were compromised back in August, so potentially the FBI didn't show up and say, hey, you guys have been under attack for a while. They might still be compromised. Those are the top industry targets for the week. For today's discussion, we're going to be talking about a company called LoopPay. This is a Massachusetts-based company that was recently acquired by Samsung in February for about $250 million. So, Jeff, what's going on with LoopPay?
Yeah, LoopPay had a similar situation. Like you said with Scottrade, they were informed by an outside party about their breach. Same thing with LoopPay. I believe someone was researching this Chinese espionage group, which either goes by the code name the Cadosa Group or Sunshot Group. And they ended up finding some of this LoopPay data. So then they ended up informing LoopPay about the breach.
LoopPay is kind of like Apple Pay, isn't it? That's kind of what it is.
Yeah, well, it's basically Samsung's response to Apple Pay. In the U.S., Samsung Pay just came out, I think, September 28th, so just a couple weeks ago. And then it came out in South Korea, I believe, back in August. But the reason Samsung purchased this company, LoopPay, is because they have some interesting technology related to mobile payments. LoopPay developed this technology called magnetic secure transaction. So this MST technology, what it does is it emulates the commonly used magnetic stripe cards. Matt was just talking about how his card has the chip and pin. Most of the cards, the old cards, have the magnetic stripes. And this technology is now implemented into the Samsung Pay. And what it does is it kind of gives Samsung a competitive advantage compared to, say, like Apple Pay or Android Pay, because Samsung Pay can be used at the old cash registers. So basically it's backwards compatible, and it can be used pretty much anywhere except for spots where you have to insert the entire card, like a gas pump or ATM machine. So anyways, back to this breach, what happened is it appears that this Chinese hacking group were after this magnetic secure transaction intellectual property. At least that's what some executives have said from LoopPay. Samsung's chief privacy officer, they issued a statement trying to downplay the concerns. They said Samsung Pay was not impacted and at no point was any personal information at risk. Then they went on to stress that it's an isolated incident and it targeted the LoopPay corporate network, which is a physically separate network from the Samsung Pay network.
Yeah, so this wasn't like a point of sale breach or something like that. I mean, so the technology was still sound. This was, from what it's sounding like, this was actually like an attack on the company itself, as opposed to like trying to get customer payment credentials and things. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and on one hand, it's bad news for Samsung, but on the other hand, it shows that this technology is valuable technology, that they're being targeted by China, once again, talking about China. Just to highlight how this is doing in South Korea, where it's been out over a month. In the first month since its launch in South Korea, Samsung Pay said that they processed $30 million worth of purchases and around 1.5 million transactions. It seemed to me, Matt, that there was a lot of really big stories this week. I know we were kind of talking about that with some of our coworkers. When the week started, we're reading the news and collecting all this stuff. We had this LoopPay breach, which happened a little later in the week, but then, Scottrade, Patreon, and then another huge story was this Experian T-Mobile breach too, right?
Yeah, and this was a pretty big one. Experian made headlines this week after reports said the credit bureau was the victim of a data breach. The kicker about this data breach was it actually compromised the information of 15 million T-Mobile customers. These T-Mobile customers actually had their personal information obtained. It affected T-Mobile customers who applied for postpaid services or phone financing between September 1st, 2013 and September 13th, 2015. So you're talking a 2-year span. Customer information exposed in this breach, it included names, birth dates, addresses, and social security numbers. No payment information was obtained, but here we have a situation, one company, a big company like Experian, they're the ones that get breached, but because of information they had on another company, they're the ones that ultimately are, really are affected by it. So that was a pretty big story this week.
T-Mobile's CEO, he was on Twitter, and he was kind of, at least what I got from the tweets he was saying was that they were looking to switch away from Experian, doing the credit checks on their customers. And in the statement that they put out, he said, obviously I'm incredibly angry about the data breach and will institute a thorough review of our relationship with Experian. So just, it was a little different tone than you usually see, probably because it was a third party. A lot of times these statements are pretty cut and dry, the same thing. But this one was definitely had a little bit of anger at Experian in the press release that they put out.
We hear about, talk about third party compromises all the time, but this is Experian. I mean, this is everyone knows who Experian is. You would think that you could trust your information with a company like that, as we see that's often not true, and everyone's kind of suspect.
Well, I know in the past hackers have targeted a lot of these data collection agencies, or like LexisNexis, I know was targeted, and obviously you're going to be targeted by hackers, if you're an agency that's that big. So those were some of the big cybercrime events that happened. Moving on, we'll catch you guys up on some of the cyber advisories that Surfwatch Labs picked up this week. There was quite a few advisories, but probably one of the biggest ones was this YSpectre malware, or maybe it's YSpectre. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It was discovered by Palo Alto Networks, And the malware attacks both jailbroken and non-jailbroken iOS devices, which is interesting because usually it's just the jailbroken devices that a lot of this malware targets. And what it does is it exploits APIs to, quote, implement malicious functionalities. So iOS users in China and Taiwan are currently at risk from this malware. And then another big story in the news is we have this Outlook malware. A lot of people are writing about that this week. Researchers from Cybereason discovered this malware that affects an organization's Outlook web application, and it leads to the theft of email passwords. The hackers in this case managed to gain a foothold into a highly strategic asset, the OWA server, wrote the Cybereason researchers. Almost by definition, OWA requires organizations to define a relatively lax set of restrictions, and in this case, OWA was configured in a way that allowed internet-facing access to the server. And this enabled hackers to establish persistent control over the entire organization's environment without being detected for a period of several months.
Another advisory we had to do with residual data left on phones. After a user, they're done with the phone, they either keep it or get rid of it. Phones being sold on Amazon, eBay, and Gazelle come with the old data from the prior user, according to research from Blanco Technology Group and Kroll OnTrack. Their research found that 35% of these phones contained residual data. Over 2,000 emails and 10,000 text messages were recovered from the phones that were analyzed. No residual data was recovered on any Apple iOS device analyzed. So when you're going to sell your old phone, guys, if you do that, just keep in mind that you might still have some information out there left on the phone.
After the story came out, I know, Matt, you and some of the other people in the company were we have our Apple fanboys, I guess you'd call them in the company. And
or as Adam calls them, the Borg.
Yeah.
We found,
yeah. This story kind of gives more fuel to the fire that Apple is safer and blah, 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 blah. Paul Henry, he's an IT security consultant for the Blanco Technology Group. He was quoted in the Register, and he said that Apple devices use encrypted storage, so that deletion of the encryption key makes recovery impossible. But Android devices, on the other hand, do not use this method and rely upon a user overwriting data to erase it and prevent it from being recoverable. Most users generally just do a factory reset, which doesn't obviously delete all the data. Whereas with Apple, it deletes the encryption key, so they couldn't get at the data anyways. And that's the reason for that. But I'm still not really an Apple guy myself.
Neither am I.
Moving on, we'll run down some of the legal news that's impacting businesses this week. So last week we talked about LinkedIn and a different settlement, but this week they were back in the news for another class action lawsuit. This one was related to their controversial email sending policy. Anyone who's used LinkedIn knows that if you don't disable all the emails you get after you sign up, you're getting like a bazillion emails. And what happened was the company has agreed to pay $13 million because of these excessive emails. I believe you could basically import your contacts, and then it would send an email to those contacts. Well, LinkedIn actually sent 3 emails to those contacts. So those other 2 emails were considered spam or basically excessive emails. And that led to this payout. So according to the settlement, the maximum payout for any member will be $1,500, though from what I've read, it's probably going to be much less than that, depending on how many people make claims.
In other legal news, on October 6th, the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that the data sharing agreement, also known as Safe Harbor, between the United States and the European Union was invalid. The ruling was based on the United States' failure to show that current laws and practices, quote, ensure an adequate level of protection for Europeans' rights to privacy. The Safe Harbor policy was originally established in 2000. So, what does this mean? Tuesday's ruling struck down the most common way to legally transfer data between Europe and the U.S. It doesn't turn multinational companies into outlaws immediately, wrote PC World, but they'd better start working on alternatives now.
Yeah, so this seems like a pretty wide-reaching ruling. PC World, they were listening on to a conference call for the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and on that conference call, the lawyers were basically agreeing that This is an area that's going to remain murky for the coming months or even coming years, but enterprises out there really need to be looking at alternatives to safe harbor because of this ruling. There's been, sort of mixed reaction on the effects that it's going to have. For example, I think like Microsoft said it's not really going to affect their consumer services because they already have other stuff in place. And the Internet Association, which is an industry body that represents, like Amazon, Google, Netflix, they said that companies have mechanisms in place to effectuate data transfers beyond safe harbor. But it added that it's mainly the smaller companies and consumers in the US and EU that could experience significant challenges going forward. So there's a lot of concern about it potentially affecting the economies, particularly small businesses in the US as well as in Europe. And the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, they're a think tank, they put out a statement on it, and they said that this ruling will disrupt not just thousands of U.S. and European companies that currently depend on safe harbor to do business across the Atlantic, but also the broader digital economy. And they went on to say, aside from taking an axe to the undersea fiber optic cables connecting Europe to the United States, it is hard to imagine a more disruptive action to transatlantic digital commerce. But that's another story that's probably going to continue to develop over the coming months.
So moving on to other charges and arrests, we have a trucking executive and hacker that were arrested for extortion. 2 men have been arrested for their role in an extortion attempt against a Chicago area software company. I'm going to get these names wrong, guys, but I'm going to give it the old college try. Stefan Stojanovic of Serbia and Love Freightways president Nemanja Lovray. What do you think, Jeff? Did I get?
I think that's like the total like Wisconsin pronunciation of her name. I can't do any better, so go with it.
You have a Serbian hacker and the president of a freight company. They collaborated in this crime. The Serbian hacker hacked the Chicago area software company servers back in May and threatened to expose sensitive information, including employee usernames and passwords, unless the company paid him $40,000. The company did pay $40,000, and the money was deposited in a California account controlled by the Love Freightways president and signed by him. So that's kind of how police oh, okay, you guys are in cahoots, and they both got arrested. Then we have twin brothers plead guilty to multiple charges, and they got very light sentences. They both pleaded guilty to several hacking charges, including accessing U.S. State Department systems to steal passport and visa information, as well as stealing 3,000 payment cards and committing about $30,000 in fraud. The twins potentially face multiple decades in prison for their crimes. However, both brothers received much lesser punishments. One brother received 39 months in prison for his role, and the other brother received about a 2-year sentence.
Yeah, and there's a few other arrests and charges that were made this week. Alexander Alvarez, he was sentenced last Friday to 18 months in prison after pleading guilty for his role in stealing more than $100,000 from customers at a bank where he was employed. Again, some more insider activity. Alvarez conducted his activities from January 2012 through February 2013. He's been ordered to pay full restitution as well as interest to the bank. And then we have more Chinese news. We've been talking about it every week. Again, we have a Chinese businessman who has pleaded guilty to corporate espionage charges. He was charged with scheming to steal trade secrets from several companies in the United States, as well as trade secrets from the United States government, and he pled guilty to 1 count of stealing those trade secrets. And that wraps up all of the trending cyber events, advisories, and legal actions from the past week. Before we get to our interview on EMV technology, we're going to throw it over to you, Matt, for the funny story of the week. Did you find anything interesting out there this week?
I did. Let me say this first. I'm not a thief. I don't possess the necessary traits to really steal anything. Matter of fact, I remember one time I forgot to pay for some jerky at our local gas station. Jeff, you know what I'm talking about. So I walked all the way back at Donna's Gas and Grocery. So I walked all the way back across town to pay for it. I'm not looking for a medal. I'm just, proving a point, that I don't have the mindset to steal. Having said that, I do think I'm smart enough to realize that there are certain things to watch out for when attempting to steal something. Let's look at technology. For example, our phones, tablets, and computers have come a long way over the years in terms of technological advances. Did you know that iPads have a GPS locator in them?
I think I know where this story's going.
Okay. Well, one guy either didn't know, didn't care, or somehow thought he would be lucky enough to avoid having his location compromised as a result of the built-in GPS in these iPads. Isaiah Montoya was recently arrested and charged with 5 counts of automotive burglary and 5 counts of receiving stolen property after police were led to his place of residence due to the GPS locator contained in one of the iPads he recently stole. One of the victims reached out to law enforcement and informed them that his iPad was stolen. When law enforcement showed up to Montoya's residence via the GPS on the iPad, they found several other iPads and even a binder which contained Albuquerque Fire Department personnel information. So maybe he was going to do some type of ID fraud or something. Montoya fled the scene, only to be found and arrested shortly after. So a little advice to Isaiah. Next time, you should really pay more attention to what you're stealing. Or just go and get a job. The latter is probably a safer bet.
You know, I've had 2 iPods stolen in my life, so now I'm kind of hoping someone steals it again so I can go ahead and track them down.
Please follow the GPS on this. I'm stolen. I got my stuff stolen here.
All right, now coming up, we have our interview with Monica Eaton-Cardone. She is the managing partner for eConsumer Services, and we talk about the October 1st shift in liability and other issues surrounding the transition to EMV technology in the United States. As I'm sure you know, on October 1st of this year, a shift in liability occurred in regards to card-present transactions. So just wondering if you could, for those unfamiliar with what happened, just maybe quickly fill us in on what that means.
Sure. So effective October 1st this year, then something was instituted called EMV. And EMV stands for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa. And what this means is it's actually that little chip, and it looks like a microchip, and it's embedded into a credit card. And that's essentially like a little tiny computer, and it allows for instant communication between your bank and another bank to be able to validate that a transaction is not fraudulent. This is actually technology that has been used in credit cards and plastic payment types in just about every other country that has really, or first world country like Europe and Canada. The U.S. has been one of the very last countries to implement this. And one of the reasons why this stuff is important is because it actually protects the card holder, like you and I, from getting our card number stolen from using that swipe. So let me explain how this happens. Let's say you go to the gas station and you swipe your credit card, and you do this every time because, let's face it, that's the very most convenient way. The thing is, little did you know, there's something called a skimmer. It's a little tiny device, and you can't even see it. You don't even know. You can barely detect it. But whenever you swipe your credit card, a criminal just before you had put a skimmer there, and he instantly read all the information on your credit card. He has all of your details, and he can start using your credit card and go about means of actually stealing your entire identity. And this is a huge problem in what's called card-present fraud. So the U.S. has had a significant problem. In fact, the skimming type of fraud is the largest, by far, type of fraud with card-present, meaning you present your card in person or swipe the card, types of transactions. In Europe, when they implemented the card chip, which now you have a chip, and if you've seen some of the chip readers, you dip your chip. Funny, this is what they call it. But you dip your chip into this machine. It takes a little bit longer than normal, but you don't actually slide anything. And then instantly there's communication between the banks. It's not just, from point A to point B. It's actually A to B, B to A to B to verify, okay, this customer, they've shopped at this gas station in the last few months. They're secure. They've gone to all these places. There's no suspicious buying patterns. Their payment is approved. And you'll watch, you don't even have to sign the transaction. And what's best, you don't have to worry about being a victim of the skimming technology. So as soon as we have this instituted across every single card, a lot of banks are very slow in getting this implemented because it is a very costly expense. We should basically eliminate the card skimming fraud.
Yeah, I just had a question about that. Just popped into my mind. You said that you don't even have to do a signature. Now, I was reading that we're going to do the chip and signature as opposed to like a chip and pin transaction. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yes, well, a lot of vendors, you'll see based on the amount of the transaction and also based on how frequently you may shop at that particular vendor, there's now additional intelligence that is being analyzed in a millisecond and reviewed and scored to determine your level of risk for that transaction. So you'll notice now if you go to the gas station and you use that chip and your gas station receipt is $48, then you probably don't have to sign a credit card or you don't have to sign the receipt. They just tell you to, you're taken care of, go. You don't have to sign. If you do have a larger transaction, then the merchant will likely ask for a signature. But I think as things progress, we'll follow suit with other countries that have implemented the same type of technology. And sooner than later, the signature method of additional security will probably become obsolete.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you then about what this means for businesses. At least from what I've read, the main thing is now if a consumer swipes one of these cards at a business that doesn't have this new technology, then they're going to be liable for any fraud that results from that. And that's sort of the main takeaway that I got. Is that correct in my understanding?
Yes. Unfortunately for businesses that choose not to upgrade their terminals to be able to accept a chip-based card, they will now be responsible for eating the cost of all of the fraudulent charges that they may undergo. So they won't have rights to dispute these charges, and this is really their penalty. So there's a lot of fear right now in the industry with merchants worrying about getting targeted for fraudulent claims because certain fraudsters or criminals may actually start cultivating different merchants that they know have not actually implemented this technology.
Yeah, and I read a study, I think this was probably a couple months back at this point, but I think it said that only around 30%, I think it was just small businesses, but only around 30% of small businesses indicated that they were planning on upgrading their systems before this deadline. And then it also said, I think more than half weren't even aware of it. So I just wondered if you have a sense of, is that still a problem that a lot of businesses might not even know that this liability shift happened?
A lot of small businesses, they don't do enough transaction volume and they don't get enough attention to really generate a whole lot of fraudulent liability. Let's take, a small boutique store, and they do a few hundred transactions a month that are card swiped, and they know most of their customers. Because they haven't experienced any type of card skimming fraud, they probably haven't had an interest in getting educated about different ways to prevent fraud like this in the future. And also their processors and all of the people that do business in this particular industry, they wouldn't be a number one target to educate about preventing this type of thing. I think what we'll end up seeing is a trend that will be instituted at the much larger brands, stores like Target, who has had issues with data breaches, as we know. Home Depot, Walmart, some of these large store brands will be implementing the chip-based technology, and this will produce kind of a domino effect. And we do know that one thing is always consistent, and that is merchants and business owners always listen to the demands and wants of their consumers. So if customers start asking, hey, I want to make sure my transaction is secure, then we will probably see these small business owners follow suit and up the ante, pay the extra fee in order to get more compliant. And that's really a win-win solution for us all.
Over the past few months reading articles, I've read a few businesses, they cite that they're concerned about the cost of upgrading. Just wondering if you have a sense of what the cost is to upgrade to this new system?
It really depends on what you need to replace your technology and then upgrade your the physical terminal. So I think for a very small business, probably on the smallest scale, you're probably looking at about $2,000. And then you can do the math depending on, if you're a much larger chain, then you figure you're paying that cost just to upgrade the terminal, plus you're paying additional software costs, and then you have every checkout and all of you basically, it's kind of like that trickle down effect, where you're operating with legacy systems, and now you're really going to have to reintegrate everything. For a smaller business, it's a lower barrier to entry because chances are they don't have really in-depth, sophisticated programs that they're using to track and integrate all of their transactions. So their cost is probably a little bit more palatable than a larger enterprise that really, this is definitely hitting their bottom line and may actually be taking other expenses or harboring other budgets.
Say a business is looking to implement this technology and to upgrade. Are there any particular challenges besides cost or anything that they should be aware of that they might not know about?
The cost is going to be one challenge. The other thing that you always have to keep in mind is whenever you use, it would be like the transition between a Windows machine versus a Mac. They still do the same thing, right? But if you've always used a Windows machine, then you also have, even though the Mac seems like it's faster, it should be better, it's really cool looking, still, you'll get it, it has the same functions, but you also have an investment in just getting trained in just how to use that new system. So these are things that business owners should also be aware of. And sometimes it really does pay off to take a look at, if you are a business owner, 7 years ago, there were still some small businesses that did payroll by hand. Today, you would probably be hard-pressed to find any business that doesn't outsource this activity. So with these types of technology advances, then it's a good idea to really get on board and advance your technology. It's probably going to be an inevitable transition, and it's something that is going to help with different software adjustments. I guess similar to upgrading your machine. If you're still working on a Windows machine that had Windows 95, chances are it may still work, but you're really cutting yourself out of a lot of other opportunities because you won't be a viable resource to get connected.
My final question is just trying to get a sense of what this will mean for fraud in the U.S. has been, obviously, if you follow the news, there's been a lot of point-of-sale cybercrime and stolen payment cards and stuff like that. And a lot of people from the articles I've read and the people I've talked to, everyone sort of seems to predict that once this does get widely implemented, a lot of that cybercrime is just going to shift to the card not present environment and online transactions and stuff. Just wondering if you agree with that or if you have any thoughts on how this might sort of shift how cyber criminals attempt to steal stuff.
I absolutely agree with that. Unfortunately, the criminal entrepreneurs, they also are business owners, but they operate in a criminal enterprise. And unfortunately, if you are an entrepreneur and you run a business, even if it is a criminal type of activity like card skimming, then you're not going to allow yourself to just go out of business. You'll end up migrating to another vertical or another type of landscape. And the virtual landscape right now is growing at such a fast and rapid pace. There's so many different layers of technology that as much as the rest of us are really trying to keep all of that criminal activity out, every day there's probably a new loophole that is being exploited and exposed, because this is what happens when you get technology more complicated. It acts as kind of a hiding ground for even more criminal activity. So yeah, it's really, I think we can definitely take a look at getting hit with a lot of CNP fraud, which is going to be card not present online type of fraud, as these criminals just migrate from stealing credit card numbers through skimming devices to finding much more sophisticated and unfortunately even more harder to detect ways of stealing cards online.
And that'll do it for this week's Cybercrime and Business podcast. Big thanks to eConsumer Services' Monica Eaton-Cardone for stopping by to fill us in on EMV. And as always, this podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact of their business, and proactively address threats head-on. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow us on iTunes, YouTube, and all the major podcasting sites. And for more information on staying safe from cybercrime, check out surfwatchlabs.com.